The girl in the distance. The train arrived in Velmora just before sunset, though in that part of the world sunset came long before evening truly began. Elias Moreau stood alone on the narrow platform, his dark wool coat trembling beneath the northern wind. Snow drifted slowly through the pale air like ash, from a dying fire covering the old railway tracks. In a silence so complete it almost felt sacred. The station behind him looked abandoned. One dim lantern flickered above the wooden entrance, casting a weak, amber glow across the frost-covered windows. Beyond the station stretched the endless wilderness of northern Europe. Black forests, frozen lakes, and distant mountains buried beneath white storms. Velmora. Even the name sounded cold. Elias adjusted the strap of his camera bag over his shoulder and exhaled slowly. His breath disappeared into the winter air like smoke from a ghost. He had traveled across half the continent to reach this forgotten town, not because he wanted adventure, not because he sought beauty, but because there was nothing waiting for him back in Paris anymore. 3 years earlier, he had been someone else entirely. Back then, he had laughed more easily, slept peacefully, believed in futures. Back then, Claire was still alive. The memory entered his mind the same way it always did, sudden and cruel, rain against a windshield. Her trembling voice, the sharp turn of headlights, then silence. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Even now, 3 winters later, guilt lived inside him like an old wound that refused to heal properly. He had survived the crash. Claire had not. And sometimes he wondered if survival itself had been the punishment. The wind howled through the station. A distant church bell rang once, somewhere beyond the snowy hills. Elias opened his eyes again and forced himself to move. A narrow road led from the station into the heart of Velmora. The town appeared almost unreal beneath the falling snow rows of dark wooden houses, steep rooftops, heavy with ice-glowing windows hidden behind curtains. Small golden lights burned weakly against the endless white landscape. Yet, despite the warmth of those lights, the town felt strangely lifeless. No laughter, no voices, no footsteps, only snow. It reminded Elias of an old photograph left too long in darkness. As he walked, he noticed something peculiar. Every house had heavy locks on the doors. Several windows were reinforced with iron bars, and nearly all the townspeople he passed avoided looking directly at him. A woman carrying groceries lowered her gaze immediately. An old man smoking beneath a street lamp crossed himself as Elias approached. Further ahead, 2 children stopped playing in the snow and hurried inside the moment the church bell rang a second time. The unease settled into Elias slowly. Not fear. Not yet. Just the strange sensation that he had arrived somewhere people did not wish to be remembered. At the edge of town stood the hotel, the Aurora, a tall wooden building overlooking the frozen lake beyond Velmora's forest line. Warm light glowed behind its frosted windows, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney into the darkening sky. Inside, the scent of burning pine wood and old books greeted him immediately. The woman behind the front desk looked to be in her 60s. Thin silver hair framed a pale face lined with exhaustion. She wore a long black dress beneath a wool cardigan, and her eyes carried the distant sadness of someone who had spent too many winters alone. "You are the photographer," she said softly. Her accent was difficult to place. Scandinavian, perhaps. Elias nodded. "I emailed last month." "Yes," she replied. "Monsieur Moreau." She handed him a brass room key. "You arrived just before the storm." Elias glanced toward the windows. Outside, the snowfall had become heavier. "I've seen worse," he said quietly. The old woman studied him for a moment longer than necessary. That is what people often say before winter teaches them humility. Something about the way she spoke unsettled him. Not threatening, simply honest. "My name is Ingrid," she continued. "The kitchen closes at 9, and after dark." She hesitated. Elias waited. "It is better not to wander too far from the hotel." He gave a tired smile. "I'm only here to photograph the northern lights." Ingrid did not smile back. "The lights are not the only things people see in Velmora." A long silence followed. Then she turned away as though regretting she had spoken at all. That night, Elias stood alone beside the frozen lake with his camera mounted on a tripod. The world around him was impossibly beautiful. Green auroras drifted across the heavens like rivers of living silk. Snowflakes spun slowly through the darkness, illuminated beneath moonlight, so pale it almost looked blue. The lake stretched endlessly before him, covered in glass-like ice and drifting fog. For the first time in years, Elias felt something close to peace. Not happiness, but quiet. And after so much grief, quiet was enough. He raised the camera and adjusted the lens toward the sky. Click. Another photograph. Click. The wind moved softly through the surrounding pine trees. Then suddenly, Elias froze. Someone was standing across the lake, far away, almost hidden within the snowfall. At first he thought it was merely a trick of light, but then the figure moved slightly. A woman. She stood completely motionless in the middle of the snow-covered lake, wearing a long white dress untouched by frost or wind. Her dark hair drifted gently around her face, and she was staring directly at him. Elias felt his chest tighten. No one should have been out there, not in weather like this. He lowered the camera slowly. "Hello?" he called. The wind swallowed his voice immediately. The woman did not answer. She simply remained there, impossibly still against the storm. A strange feeling crept through him then. Not fear, recognition, as though somewhere deep inside himself, he already knew her. Elias took a cautious step onto the frozen lake. Then another. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The woman remained motionless. Closer now. Close enough for him to see the outline of her face. Pale skin, thin shoulders, eyes darker than the winter sky itself. "Are you all right?" he asked. No response. The wind grew stronger. Auroras twisted overhead like ghostly flames. And suddenly, the woman vanished. Not slowly, not naturally. One moment she stood before him. The next, there was only falling snow. Elias stopped breathing. He looked around wildly. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Only endless white stretching across the frozen lake. A deep chill crawled through his spine. He turned and hurried back toward the hotel. Behind him, the northern lights shimmered silently over Valmora, like something ancient awakening beneath the heavens. Later that night, Elias sat alone in his room reviewing the photographs from the lake. Most were beautiful. The auroras, the mountains, the snow-covered forest. Then he found the image. The woman. His breath caught instantly. She stood perfectly visible in the distance beneath the green lights. Yet her face was blurred. Not out of focus. Not distorted by movement. It looked almost smeared, as though the photograph itself refused to capture her features properly. Elias zoomed in closer. The longer he stared, the more uneasy he became. There was something deeply wrong about the image. A knock interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door to find Ingrid standing outside, holding a candle lantern. "I saw your room light," she said quietly. "I wanted to make sure you returned safely from the lake." "I'm fine," Elias answered. Then, after hesitating, he showed her the photograph. The moment Ingrid saw it, the color drained from her face. Her hand trembled slightly. "Where did you take this?" "Near the lake." The old woman stared at the blurred figure for several seconds without speaking. Then she whispered, "Dear God." Elias frowned. "You know her." Ingrid looked up slowly. Fear lived openly in her eyes now. "If she has begun appearing to you," her voice nearly broke, "you must leave Valmora before the next snowfall." The candlelight flickered violently between them. Outside, the storm intensified, and somewhere far beyond the hotel walls, deep within the frozen wilderness surrounding the town, a woman was still standing in the snow waiting. The town that buried Love Elias barely slept after Ingrid's warning. The image of the girl outside his window remained burned into his mind long after dawn arrived over Valmora, not because she had frightened him, but because of the sadness in her eyes. It was not the expression of something evil. It was grief. The kind of grief that lasted so long it eventually became part of the soul itself. By morning, the storm had softened into a slow, silver snowfall drifting across the rooftops of the town. Elias sat alone beside the hotel window, with a cup of black coffee growing cold between his hands. Outside, Valmora looked almost peaceful, but beneath that stillness, something felt deeply wrong. The townspeople moved quickly through the streets with their heads lowered. No one lingered outdoors longer than necessary. No one laughed. Even the children seemed strangely quiet. And every now and then, Elias caught people staring at him. Not with curiosity, with pity, as though they already knew something terrible was going to happen. The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. At noon, he found Ingrid in the hotel dining room, lighting candles beside the windows. "You said I should leave," Elias said quietly. "Why?" The old woman did not answer immediately. For a long moment, only the crackling fireplace filled the silence between them. Finally, she looked up. "Because she has chosen you." Elias frowned. The woman near the lake, Ingrid, nodded once. "She appears every few winters, always to men who arrive alone, men carrying sorrow." A cold sensation crept through his chest. "Who is she?" Ingrid's hands tightened slightly around the candle. Her name was Elena Voss. The name sounded strangely beautiful, like something pulled from an old poem. "She died many years ago," Ingrid continued softly, "long before I was born. But in Velmora, death does not always mean disappearance." Elias leaned forward slightly. "You believe she's a ghost. I believe this town remembers pain better than it remembers joy." The answer frustrated him. People don't just appear and disappear in snowstorms. Ingrid looked at him carefully. "Then perhaps you should explain the photograph." Elias said nothing, because he could not. That evening, unable to shake the growing obsession in his mind, Elias left the hotel and walked deeper into town. Snow drifted softly beneath the darkening sky, while yellow lanterns flickered beside narrow roads. The cold air carried the scent of pine wood smoke and distant frost. He eventually found the town's small archive building beside the church. The librarian inside was an elderly man named Henrik, thin and pale, with thick glasses perched on his nose. At first, he refused to help, but the moment Elias mentioned Elena's name, the old man's expression changed completely. Fear. Real fear. "You should not ask about her," Henrik whispered. "I only want to understand." "No," the old man replied shakily. "You want answers. And answers are dangerous in Velmora." But eventually, after much persuasion, Henrik disappeared into the back room and returned carrying an old leather-bound book covered in dust. He opened it carefully across the table. Inside were black and white photographs from decades earlier. Families, snowstorms, funerals. And then Elias saw her. His breath stopped instantly. Elena Voss. Even in the faded photograph, she was impossibly beautiful. Dark hair cascading over pale shoulders. Sharp, melancholic eyes. A sadness hidden beneath elegance. She stood beside a young man with gentle features and a heavy wool coat. "Lucien Armand," Henrik said quietly. "The man she loved." Elias stared at the photograph. Something twisted painfully inside him. Not jealousy. Recognition. The expression on Elena's face beside Lucien reminded him of Claire. The way Claire used to look at him before everything was destroyed. "What happened to them?" Elias asked. Henrik closed the book slowly. "Winter happened." The old man leaned back in his chair, eyes distant with memory. Nearly 80 years ago, Velmora was different. Rich families controlled the town. Elena came from one of them. Lucien did not. Outside, the wind howled softly against the church walls. "They fell in love anyway," Henrik continued. "People said they were inseparable, but her family believed Lucien was beneath her. They tried to force her into another marriage." Elias remained silent. One night during a storm, Henrik whispered, Lucien disappeared. The room suddenly felt colder. No body was ever found. Henrik shook his head slowly. A week later, Elena walked onto the frozen lake alone. His voice nearly faded. She never came back either. Silence filled the archive. Heavy. Ancient. Then Henrik looked directly into Elias's eyes. After her death, strange things began happening in Velmora. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Men started vanishing during snowstorms. Travelers. Hunters. Wanderers. Most were found frozen somewhere near the lake. Henrik swallowed nervously. And some were never found at all. That night, Elias could not stop thinking about Elena. The photograph haunted him. The sadness in her face. The loneliness. He tried convincing himself it was merely fascination. The imagination of a grieving man trapped in a remote town during winter. But deep down, he knew that was a lie, because part of him wanted to see her again, and that terrified him. Around midnight, unable to resist the pull any longer, Elias grabbed his coat and camera before leaving the hotel. The snowfall had grown heavier again. Velmora slept beneath darkness and ice. Only the church bell echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. Elias walked toward the frozen lake, almost unconsciously, as though guided by something older than reason itself. The wind moved violently through the trees now. Branches creaked overhead like distant screams. And then he saw her, standing beside the shoreline. Closer this time, Elena. She wore the same white dress, untouched by snow or frost. Her dark hair drifted gently around her pale face, while the storm moved through her like mist through moonlight. Elias stopped breathing. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then slowly, Elena turned toward him. Her eyes were impossibly sad. Not empty, not monstrous, simply heartbroken. "You're real," Elias whispered. The moment the words left him, Elena lowered her gaze, as though hearing them caused her pain. Elias stepped closer carefully. "I'm not afraid of you." The wind screamed across the lake. Elena finally looked up again, and for the first time she spoke. Everyone says that at first. Her voice barely sounded human. Soft, distant, like music drifting beneath frozen water. Elias felt chills spread through his entire body. "You've been watching me." Elena nodded once. "Because you are lonely." The truth of it struck him harder than expected. He opened his mouth to deny it. But Claire's face flashed suddenly through his mind. The hospital lights, the blood, the unbearable silence afterward. Elena stepped closer. Still, no footprints formed beneath her bare feet. "You carry death inside you," she whispered. Elias stared at her in shock. "How do you know that?" A faint sadness touched her expression. "Because I do too." The storm intensified around them. For a moment, the entire world seemed to vanish into white darkness. And then Elias realized something horrifying. He no longer wanted to leave. Not the town, not the lake, not even her. Because, for the first time since Claire died, someone looked at him as though they understood his pain completely. And that frightened him more than any ghost ever could. Suddenly, a sharp voice shattered the silence. "Get away from her!" Elias turned violently. A man stood near the tree line holding a lantern and a hunting rifle. Tall, bearded, terrified. "Elena," the man shouted furiously. "Leave him alone." The instant the lantern light touched her face, Elena stepped backward. Pain flashed through her eyes. Then she vanished into the snowstorm once again. Elias stumbled forward instinctively. Wait, but she was already gone. Only swirling snow remained. The man approached quickly, breathing hard. "You idiot," he snapped. "Do you want to die?" Elias stared at him angrily. "Who are you?" "Matthias," the man answered. "And unlike you, I know what happens to men who follow her into the storm." Elias looked back toward the lake. "She's not dangerous." Matthias laughed bitterly. "That's exactly what the others said." A deep unease settled into Elias's stomach. "What others?" The hunter's face darkened. "Every man she chooses eventually walks into the snow and never comes back." The wind roared violently across the frozen lake. And somewhere beyond the storm, hidden within endless white darkness, Elena was still watching him. Where the dead still wait, the storm lasted 3 more days. By the 4th morning, Velmora no longer felt like a town hidden beneath winter. It felt buried by it. Snow swallowed the roads. Ice covered the windows of the Aurora Hotel in pale veins of frost, and the frozen lake beyond the forest had disappeared beneath a white fog so dense it looked almost alive. Elias barely left his room, not because of Matthias's warning, but because Elena had entered his thoughts completely. He could still hear her voice. "You carry death inside you." The words haunted him because they were true. For years, Elias had blamed himself for Claire's death, with such quiet devotion that guilt had become inseparable from love. He had convinced himself that suffering was the only thing he deserved afterward. But Elena looked at him differently. Not with accusation, with understanding. And somehow that frightened him more than judgment ever could. Late that evening, Elias found Ingrid alone in the hotel lobby, feeding wood into the fireplace, while shadows flickered across the walls behind her. "She's not evil," he said quietly. Ingrid did not look surprised. "They all say that." "She's suffering." The old woman sighed deeply. "Pain can become dangerous when it survives too long." Elias stepped closer. What really happened to Elena? For several moments, Ingrid remained silent. Then finally she whispered, "The town killed the man she loved." The fire cracked softly. Outside wind scraped against the hotel walls like fingernails. Lucian discovered something, Ingrid continued. Something powerful families in Velmora wanted hidden. He planned to leave town with Elena before winter ended. Her tired eyes lowered toward the flames, but they never allowed him the chance. A cold heaviness settled inside Elias's chest. What did they do to him? Ingrid closed her eyes briefly. They dragged him onto the lake during a storm and chained him beneath the ice. The image struck Elias with brutal clarity. Black freezing water. A terrified young man beneath cracking ice. Snow falling endlessly overhead while the town watched in silence. They told Elena he abandoned her, Ingrid whispered. But she eventually learned the truth, and then she walked into the storm. Ingrid nodded slowly. She chose death because she could no longer bear the world they left her in. The room fell silent again. Elias stared into the fire, unable to speak, because suddenly he understood something horrifying. Elena was not haunting Velmora out of hatred. She remained because grief had trapped her there, the same way his own grief had trapped him since Claire died. Two lonely souls refusing to let go of the dead. That night, Elias dreamed of Claire again, but this time she was not alone. Elena stood beside her in the falling snow. The two women stared at him silently beneath a pale northern sky, while frost drifted through the darkness like ash. Claire smiled sadly. Elena simply waited. Then, the dream changed. The frozen lake appeared beneath moonlight, and beneath the ice, Elias saw a human face staring upward. Lucian. His eyes were still open, still waiting. Elias woke violently just before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. Outside his window, snow swirled beneath the faint glow of morning. And standing near the tree line beyond the hotel, Elena watched him. She looked weaker now, almost transparent against the storm. Without thinking, Elias rushed outside. The freezing wind struck him immediately, but he barely noticed. Elena. She turned slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "You should have left." "I don't want to." Pain flickered through her expression. That is how it begins. Elias stepped closer carefully. "You never wanted them to die, did you?" The wind moved softly through her dark hair. "No." "Then, why do they disappear?" Elena lowered her eyes toward the snow. "Because loneliness is colder than winter." Her voice trembled slightly. "They follow me willingly." Something inside Elias broke at those words. Not fear. Compassion. The unbearable realization that she had spent nearly 80 years wandering through storms searching for someone who would stay. Someone who understood. Elena. For the first time she looked truly fragile. Like grief itself had exhausted her. "They murdered him," she whispered, and the town buried the truth beneath the snow. Tears froze against her pale cheeks. "I waited for him every winter after he died." The storm intensified around them. "But the dead do not return." Elias stared at her silently. "Neither do the living," he thought. "Not really. Not after losing the people they love most." Suddenly, distant shouting echoed through the forest. Lantern lights appeared between the trees. Matthias emerged first, followed by several men carrying torches and rifles. "There she is," one shouted. Fear crossed Elena's face instantly. Real fear. "They're going to destroy the lake," Matthias called toward Elias. "It ends tonight." "What are you talking about?" Elias yelled back. "The curse ends with her." The men carried barrels of oil toward the frozen shoreline. Panic spread through Elias immediately. "You can't do this. You don't understand," Matthias shouted over the wind. "People have died for generations because of her." Elena stepped backward, slowly terror filling her dark eyes. Not for herself, for Elias. Then one of the men threw a torch. Flames exploded across the oil-covered ice. Fire spread violently over the frozen lake, illuminating the storm in horrifying shades of orange and gold. The ice began cracking beneath the heat. Thunder echoed across the wilderness. And suddenly, Elias heard screaming. One of the villagers had fallen through the ice. The freezing black water swallowed him instantly. Chaos erupted. The lake began collapsing beneath everyone's feet. Matthias shouted desperately for the others to retreat, but Elias couldn't move, because Elena was still standing in the center of the cracking ice, alone. The flames surrounded her like burning wings. "Elena," he screamed. She looked at him through the fire and snow, and smiled sadly. Then the ice beneath her shattered. Without hesitation, Elias ran onto the collapsing lake. Voices screamed behind him. The world dissolved into fire, wind, and white darkness. The ice cracked violently beneath every step. Then suddenly a hand caught his. Cold as winter itself. Elena. She pulled him away from a collapsing section of ice, just as freezing water exploded upward beneath him. For a brief moment they stood together in the center of the storm, while flames reflected across the snow around them. She looked more human now than ever before. Not a ghost. Not a monster. Just a girl who had suffered for far too long. Elena. Her trembling fingers touched his face softly. "If you had met me before death," she whispered, "would you have stayed?" Elias felt tears burn his eyes. Even now, after all these years, Claire's death still lived inside him. But standing there beside Elena, he finally understood something. Love and grief were never truly separate things. Sometimes grief was simply love with nowhere left to go. And maybe that was why the dead lingered. Because the heart refused to accept endings. Elias closed his eyes briefly, then answered even after death. His voice nearly broke. "I still would." Elena stared at him in silence. And for the first time since he had met her, she truly smiled. Not sadly, not hauntingly, peacefully. The storm softened around them. The flames began dying beneath the snow. And slowly, Elena started fading. Elias panicked instantly. "No." Her hand slipped gently from his. "It's over now," she whispered. Tears rolled down her pale face like melting frost. "I don't have to wait anymore." The northern lights appeared overhead once more, flowing across the heavens in soft rivers of green and silver. Beautiful. Endless. Elena stepped backward toward the center of the lake, her body dissolving slowly into drifting snow. And before she vanished completely, she whispered one final sentence. "Thank you for remembering me." Then she was gone. Only winter remained. By morning, the storm had ended. Velmora stood silent beneath pale sunlight. The townspeople searched the frozen lake for hours, but Elias Moreau was nowhere to be found. No body. No footprints leading away from the shoreline. Nothing. Only his camera resting alone in the snow. Inside it, among hundreds of photographs of forests and storms and northern lights, there was one final image. A woman in a white dress, standing beside a man beneath the aurora, both smiling softly at one another, and behind them, stretching endlessly across the frozen lake, were two sets of footprints disappearing together into the snow. Some people believe the dead disappear, but in Velmora, the snow remembers everything.